But it's not enough to vote against just bad legislation. We have a responsibility to work together when we can on bills that senators from both political parties can vote for. That's the reason for the so-called filibuster rule, 60 votes. We keep debating until 60 senators say, okay, we're ready to vote. That's what creates deliberation and debate and consensus building, not eliminating that requirement and then just passing bills by a strict majority, bills which can, by the way, be undone after the next election. And just as colleagues on this side of the aisle have identified legislation we don't want passed, absent an ability to build a bipartisan consensus, there's a litany of bills that I know our Democratic colleagues would not want passed were the shoe on the other foot. And I've been here long enough to know that eventually the shoe will be on the other foot. I've always said that I've been in the majority and I've been in the minority. And being in the majority is a lot better, a lot more enjoyable, a lot more productive from my standpoint. But eventually, the Democratic colleagues will be in the minority, perhaps as soon as after the 2022 election. And if 51 votes is all it takes to undo things that have been done, well, that's exactly what will happen. That's been the history of the filibuster that's been applied to nominations, not to legislation. I was here when Senator Harry Reid invoked the nuclear option and said, we're going to require 60 votes in order to confirm judges with a 51-vote threshold. And then when that was used to block judges on the D.C. Court of Appeals, Senator Reid invoked the nuclear option and got them passed by a strict partisan majority. The senator from Kentucky, Senator McConnell, said, I've been here a while too, and I know what goes around comes around. And what we've seen come around is 3 new Supreme Court justices during Donald Trump's time as President of the United States. You might call it the physics of the Senate. I think it was Newton, one of Newton's laws that said for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. You might call that political physics. At the start of this Congress, I promised my constituents in Texas that I would push back against dangerous proposals when needed. But I also said in the same sentence that I would work with my Democratic colleagues whenever possible, whenever I believed it was in the best interest of my 29 million constituents. And despite the partisanship that has gripped this chamber, we actually have made some progress in some areas. Not that you would read very much about it in the newspaper. The nature of news is the conflict. It's not consensus. When things are consensus, it's not news. It's not on cable TV. It doesn't swirl around social media or the internet. So we have been able to make some progress in some areas. For example, last month, the Senate passed the 61st annual National Defense Authorization Act. The 61st. That means we've done it 61 times in a row, every year for 61 years. This is good bipartisan legislation and an example of what we can do when we work together. This legislation ensures that our service members will have the resources they and their families need, both on duty and off. It makes investments in military construction and our military bases across Texas and elsewhere, and it gives our commanders and our military leaders the certainty they need to plan for the future. Another example of bipartisanship last year, not that many people remember or talk about it or write about it or hear about it on TV or see it on social media, but last summer we passed another major bipartisan piece of legislation called the U.S. Competition, Innovation and Competition Act. This legislation makes investments in critical sectors to counter threats from China. This was one of the leading proponents of this bill was a senator from New York, the majority leader, working principally with the senator from Indiana, Senator Young, and others of us. One important part of that bill that I worked on with the senator from Virginia, a Democrat, the senior senator from Virginia, Senator Warner, was funding for programs created by the CHIPS Act. It actually became law last year, but we had to find a way to pay for it, and the Senate stepped up and did so. And now we're hoping that the House will follow suit. But as consumers learned over this last year, actually COVID-19 exposed our vulnerability to supply chains from overseas. We saw that first with personal protective equipment, most of which, virtually all of which was made in China. And when we needed it here, well, we had to try to get it overseas from China to the United States so that it could protect our healthcare heroes, our frontline healthcare providers, among others. But we learned that the vulnerabilities of our supply chains did not stop with PPE. Semiconductor shortages, for example, have a very real and dramatic impact on all of our lives. We've seen this in empty car lots, more expensive electronics. The global semiconductor or microcircuit shortage is very visible. It has had a dramatic impact on our economy and threatens our national security because most of it's made overseas. 90% of the semiconductors in the world are made in Asia. If you take South Korea out of the picture, 63% of them are made in Taiwan. Taiwan. Yeah, you may have read a little bit about Taiwan in the news recently. That's President Xi has said he wants to essentially unify Taiwan with mainland China, settling an old civil war between the nationalists and the communists that started many years ago. But can you imagine what would happen if President Xi decided to invade Taiwan and what that would do to our supply chain of critical semiconductors that operate everything from our iPhone to our F-35, fifth generation stealth fighters? Well, our national defense is at stake, obviously, too, not just our economic future. From advanced fighters, quantum computing, and missile defense systems, all of them rely on semiconductors. We may have read that in the public domain that Russia and China are now they're touting their development of hypersonic missiles that travel 10 times the speed of sound. Well, our ability to defend our nation and defend our allies and help them defend themselves depend on our access to these advanced semiconductors that make things like missile defense systems operate. But just for example, a single rocket interceptor like the kind that the state of Israel have been using to intercept rockets coming into Tel Aviv and other major cities, each one of those interceptors, which is part of the Iron Dome missile defense system, contains more than 750 semiconductor chips. This is our Achilles heel. The funding from the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act will help bolster domestic semiconductor manufacturing and ensure that we won't be at the mercy of other nations for access to critical components of our supply chains. This bill is over in the House, and Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Schumer have entered into an agreement, which I hope will be consummated, that in February we will have a conference on that bill and pass, I hope, that CHIPS Act of America bill, together with the other efforts we've made to strengthen our defenses against a more aggressive People's Republic of China. Well, we don't have much time to waste because we know one of the preeminent challenges that we have in the world today is not terrorism like we experienced after 9/11, on 9/11 and thereafter. We were focused like a laser on counterterrorism. Meanwhile, Russia and China continue to rebuild and replenish their arsenals and develop new and dangerous weapons that threaten our national security and in the end threaten our freedom. In addition to these big bipartisan bills that I've mentioned, I was glad that a number of bills that I introduced became law last year. After years of fighting, we finally succeeded in making Juneteenth a national holiday. Juneteenth started in Galveston, Texas, when 2 years after the Civil War was over, the former slaves in Galveston were told, "You are free." We've been celebrating that for 40 years in Texas, and I'm proud to say we've now made this a national holiday. Hopefully this will be a source of education and reconciliation, and so people will understand our history, because as the old saying goes, those who don't remember their history are condemned to relive it. This would not have happened without the support and tenacity of advocates across Texas, including my friend, Ms. Opal Lee of Fort Worth, who's widely known as the grandmother of Juneteenth. By the way, the Dallas Morning News editorial board named her as the Woman of the Year for last year. Quite an appropriate recognition. But this bill and this holiday will preserve the history of Juneteenth for generations to come and ensure that we never forget the significance of that day when Major General Gordon Granger's troops declared that all slaves are forever free. Then we passed bipartisan bills to strengthen the policies and procedures for reporting missing service members, something very near and dear to those of us in Texas, given the terrible and tragic loss of Vanessa Guillen. We also strengthened our defense against China by strengthening our relationship with Taiwan. We passed bipartisan legislation ensuring that federal officers, no matter where they serve, that their attackers, their killers, can be brought to justice. For border states like the presiding officers and mine, we've modernized and increased staffing at points of entry at our borders with Mexico without spending taxpayer dollars. We've also closed a loophole abused by some companies fueling the opioid epidemic. Again, I could go on, but these are just a few of the bipartisan bills that I was privileged to work on and that were signed into law last year. When you add the bipartisan bills introduced by our colleagues on both sides of the aisle, it adds up to a lot of bipartisan wins for the American people. Again, you don't read about it much in the paper, you don't see it much on cable TV or read about it in social media, but it's real and it's true. It's true, and it's what I think we were sent here to do. So my conclusion is perhaps an obvious one, that even in an equally divided Senate, if we try, if maybe we resist our impulse to go it alone, we can actually work together and find bipartisan solutions. One of our former colleagues, Mike Enzi, who passed away in the recent past, when I came to the Senate, he was on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee with the liberal lion of the Senate, Teddy Kennedy. You know, I came here to the Senate, I was kind of in awe of the people I'd seen on television, and particularly the Kennedy family, who had served our nation in so many different capacities. But I asked Mike Enzi, who was perhaps one of the most conservative members of the Senate, how he and Teddy Kennedy, one of the most liberal members of the Senate, could work together and actually pass legislation. He said it's easy. It's called the 80-20 rule. You find the 80% of what you can agree on, and then you leave the 20% for another day and another fight. Depending on your viewpoint, it can either be a recipe for gridlock or a really big opportunity. And I've subscribed to the wisdom of the 80-20 rule. From what I've seen, I believe the presiding officer agrees with that as well. So instead of just focusing on the things we can't agree on, and perhaps we'll never agree on, because we have different visions for the role of the federal government in our lives, that's okay. Those are the debates we've been having since the founding of this country, and we'll have it forever, as long as this great nation lasts. But let's not just focus on the 20% we can't do, which seems to be the obsession of the news media and others. Let's think more about the 80% we can do. Rather than waste floor time, which is coin of the realm here, I mean, if it can't come to the floor because there's no floor time, it's not going to happen. So rather than waste time on partisan bills that will ultimately go nowhere, let's find common ground and work on our shared priorities. I've got one idea. How do we help families struggling to keep up with the highest inflation in nearly 4 decades? I've lived long enough to know when interest rates were close to 20% and we had double-digit inflation. It was a miserable time in this country because people's paychecks were eaten up by inflation, and they couldn't afford to buy things like houses that they ordinarily might buy to increase their standard of living because interest rates were so high on mortgage loans. Well, let's work on supply chains that have been unable to keep up with demand. Vulnerabilities that have been exposed by COVID-19. Again, the definition of intelligence, as my dad used to say, what he called the hallmark of intelligence, is learning from your mistakes, not doing the same thing over and over again, like Albert Einstein said, and expecting different results. There's also a humanitarian crisis on the border that's led to the highest number of annual apprehensions on record. I'm not confident our colleagues on the other side actually believe in enforcing our immigration laws, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's some areas that we could work on, like the senator from Arizona, Senator Sinema, and I, Henry Cuellar, a Democrat from Laredo, Tony Gonzalez, a Republican from Texas. We've worked on the Bipartisan Border Solutions Act. And we would love to be able to work with our colleagues across the aisle to find some way to address the uncontrolled access that people who have no reasonable grounds for asylum are getting and coming into our country and then fading into the great American landscape. There are other things I'd like to do in the immigration space, things like the deferred action on childhood arrivals. 10 years ago, President Obama issued an executive memorandum saying that if you were brought here as a child under certain criteria, you will be able to stay and you will be able to get work permits. But it's been in litigation for the last 10 years. The last decision by a federal district judge in Houston, Texas, Judge Hanen, said that basically the DACA and DAPA, in this case the DACA Deferred Action on Childhood Arrival memorandum, is unconstitutional, and that only Congress can address this. And I suggest we should. I've asked the chairman of the Judiciary Committee to put a bill on the floor in the Judiciary Committee that provides some certainty in a future for these young people who are now young adults living in uncertainty. Give them some certainty and some comfort, knowing that they don't need to fear deportation or some other negative consequence. Because I believe there is a broad consensus that we ought to give them some relief. In America, you don't hold children responsible for the mistakes parents make. And I believe that we could find a bipartisan solution to at least that part. And you know what? Maybe, just maybe, by doing some things together, we could increase confidence among ourselves. Yeah, we really can. We can work together. We can find bipartisan solutions. We don't have to just fight and emphasize the 20% we can agree on. We can work on that 80% and make real progress. I believe these are the types of issues that the American people sent us here to solve. Forget legislation that hands tax breaks to the wealthy or federalizes America's elections, notwithstanding the provisions of our Constitution. Let's work together to solve real problems where there is an opportunity for us to find that 80% solution. So as we welcome the start of a new year, I hope the Democratic leader, Senator Schumer, and our colleagues across the aisle will look at the 50-50 Senate with a fresh perspective. We do have an opportunity to deliver big wins to the American people this year, and I hope the Senate Majority Leader, who sets the agenda on the floor, will allow that to happen. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Bowman.